It is Indiana in the Morning, presented by First Commonwealth Bank here on WCCS AM 1160, 101.1 FM. And our conversation with Sridhar Pappu is brought to you by Bradley's Books in the Indiana Mall. And the book is a terrific one, The Year of the Pitcher, Bob Gibson, Denny McClain, and the End of Baseball's Golden Age. Let's say hello to Sridhar Pappu. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Wonderful. It's good to have you with us. 1968 World Series was the first World Series that I watched. My grandfather was a huge Stan Musial fan, loved the Cardinals, so I naturally adopted the Detroit Tigers, and I remember going up to his house a couple of blocks from mine, sitting and watching the World Series games, every single one of them, because they were all in the daytime then. And so this book really appealed to me when I heard I had the opportunity to speak with you. It really was a great one for me. So Bob Gibson, Denny McClain, but so much more happening around the 1968 World Series. And you've written this amazing book about it. What made you go to this particular event in this particular time frame in order to find this wonderful story?
Well, I think, number one, I'm a student of American history, and so 1968 obviously was one of the most tumultuous years in modern times, if not in the history of the Republic. And then also, when I, as a baseball fan, I don't know if you feel the same way, but you sort of learn the history of the game almost through osmosis, and so these names sort of pop out at you. And so when it came time to write a baseball book, I felt as if this was the perfect subject.
Oh, it certainly was. I mean, and Bob Gibson, for us, we Pirate fans, Bob Gibson was the nemesis. And, of course, with the St. Louis Cardinals for all of those years, an amazing athlete. And you contrast him with Denny McClain, who, of course, with the Tigers, won 30 games that year. Bob Gibson sets the ERA record. It was a tremendous year. And it really plays into the title of the book, The Year of the Pitcher. These two particular pitchers really stood out, didn't they, in that year?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, and they weren't alone. Louis Tiant had a phenomenal year for the Cleveland Indians. I think 8 pitchers had ERAs under 2 on consecutive nights. Gibson's teammate Ray Washburn threw a no-hitter against the San Francisco Giants, and then Gaylord Perry responded by throwing a hitter against the Cardinals. And, Don Drysdale, of course, had that amazing scoreless inning streak of over 58 and two-thirds innings. So it really encapsulated what baseball had become during that time. And
it actually changed the way the baseball was played after that, and that plays into the baseball's golden era aspect of it. I want to talk about some of the things that were happening around it, and you do a wonderful job of putting Jackie Robinson into this story. And it's a part of the story that needs to be told because of the climate of the day. You touched on it a couple of moments ago, all of the things that were going on. One of those things was the presidential election, and Jackie Robinson found himself in a really tough situation there and actually forced back into the baseball conversation as he was really not a part of it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, in his post-baseball life, he had become estranged from the very game that made him Jackie Robinson. And here he is in 1968. His family life is disintegrating. His health is terrible. And, throughout the 1960s, he was, people always remember him for supporting Richard Nixon in 1960, and he had his own reasons for doing that. But throughout the 1960s, he is a force of change, speaking for integration, speaking his own mind, regardless of party. And yet, in 1968, here he is, baseball's sort of lone voice, estranged from the game, and he's the person that had to speak out time and time again, and is called upon time and time again, whether it be from Nelson Rockefeller to Hubert Humphrey, to support these causes.
Yeah, he found himself in a really tough situation from the Democrats and from the Republicans. There he was in the middle between those two groups and taking slings and arrows from both sides. The two pitchers on which the book focuses most of all, Bob Gibson and Denny McClain, such different people. And let's start with Denny McClain. He wins over 30 games. Nobody's done that since. But one of the amazing aspects of it all is he did it with a really, really sore pitching arm that finally caught up to him when he got to the World Series.
Yeah, I mean, he was wearing down towards the end, and I think everyone could sort of see it. I mean, he could certainly see it. And you sort of have to, and by then he was basically addicted to cortisone, which, as you know, will weaken your arm. But at the time, you were expected to go out there and finish games and do your job. I mean, going on the disabled list was almost unheard of, unless, as with Bob Gibson in 1967, you break your leg, and then you have to you have to go on the disabled list. And so, by the time the series comes around, he didn't have very much going for him. So his teammate Mickey Lolich had to, in order to win that series, had to win 3 games, including the Game 7 in which he outpitched Bob Gibson.
And I remember so well sitting there with my granddad, rooting so hard for the Tigers and wondering, what's wrong with McClain? He won 31 games. We ought to be having this thing pretty much in the bag. But Bob Gibson was so tough as a pitcher, probably as intimidating a pitcher as there was, even more so than Don Drysdale. And you get into his life story and his struggles for racial acceptance, even, let alone racial equality. And it's such a fascinating story, and it's got so many twists and turns to it, bringing him to the moment of this World Series.
Yeah, I mean, Gibson's life is incredibly fascinating because, in some ways, he grew up in North Omaha, but, the story of his family, the story of his life is sort of rooted in the African migration north from the South. I mean, these were people who came north to work in the packing plants of Omaha, and he had watched his brother Josh, get a master's degree and be unable to find a job, and it was Josh that pushed him from a very young age to in his athletic career, and also pushed him to go to college, and then as time sort of wore on. Josh's influence of, being single-minded, being focused, always stayed with him. And so, and it should be noted, I sort of wish there was like a statue in Omaha to Josh Gibson, because he influenced so many players in various sports, including the likes of Bob Boozer and Johnny Rogers and Gale Sayers.
Yeah, it's one of those tremendous stories that the world probably is never going to get fully explained to it, and the justification for doing a book on him would certainly be there. Bob Gibson had this personality that was really based upon his experiences growing up. In a way, Denny McClain did too, but Denny just seemed to catch an idea that he could really do something special in terms of promotion, self-promotion, and it got out of hand. But that seems to be the way that he was built, wasn't it? The contrast between those two guys heading into this World Series is just a fascinating aspect of your book.
Well, I mean, in some ways, I think that Denny saw the future in terms of sort of building this personal brand at the very same time that Joe Namath was doing so in New York. I mean, the difference was that Denny was just a little off because, as Joe Namath was becoming, this rock star and the guy that, drove young women to the stadium, Denny thought he was going to parlay his baseball career into a musical one, playing the organ, and this is 1968. And in fact, he actually put out an album, which I haven't listened to and don't really have any attention to, since it's just not really my my thing. So.
Oh, come on. Be brave.
Yeah.
Sridhar Pappu is with us. The book is The Year of the Pitcher, Bob Gibson, Denny McClain, and the End of Baseball's Golden Age. And that aspect of the whole story is part of the Johnny Sane part of what you write. He is the representative of old school golden era baseball, and he becomes a part of this story as well. Especially with his connections with Denny McClain and as a pitching coach for a number of teams. When you think about the reaction that you're getting to this book, do you find people surprised that this was going on back then, because so many parts of the story are still a part of the discussion today.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things people always bring up, people have brought up is Johnny Sane, because I mean the book basically almost starts with Sane and this sort of image of him throwing a baseball against a wooden fence in Arkansas. And I don't think you could write about the golden age of pitching without talking about John Sane. Baseball historians, and even the casual fans will remember, the sort of rhyme "Spawn" and "Sane" and "Pray for Rain" when he was a great pitcher with the Boston Braves in the 40s. But after his pitching life was over, he just became a pitching coach that went from team to team and helped so many guys, whether it be Ralph Terry and Jim Bowden and Marty Ford with the Yankees, or Mudcat Grant and Jim Cott with the Minnesota Twins, and then finally he ends up in Detroit, where he was faced with an unachieving staff that was very talented, headed by McClain, and was able to sort of get the best out of him. And in some ways he was very old school in his thinking in terms of trying to build a pitcher's arm up by throwing constantly. But in other ways, he understands the modern athlete. He would treat each individual pitcher like an individual and talk to them, speak to them, give them motivational books, and which is at that time was kind of unheard of. And with Denny, who was interested in flying his own plane, Sane, who had been a World War II veteran and went to flight school, in fact, with Ted Williams, he talked to him about aerodynamics and flying. And so, he was able to reach Denny in a way that no one had and no one has since, really.
Yeah, it's amazing the way that you're able to draw those sort of parallels between old school baseball becoming new school baseball, and how one of the old school icons becomes one of the ones who actually breaks down what ended up being baseball's golden age. And Johnny Sane's participation in the life of Denny McClain and just the whole story is just so well written. And I thank you for joining us for some time here this morning on Indiana in the Morning. The book is The Year of the Pitcher, Bob Gibson, Denny McClain, and the End of Baseball's Golden Age. Sridhar Pappu, thanks.
No, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.